Thank you so much, Laura. As you said, this is sort of my time here is winding down, and which is of course very sort of sad for me because it's been a wonderful almost 2 years now at the Ringling, and this experience has allowed me to sort of share things like this program that we're about to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. Actually, before I do, I'm going to read a portion of the land statement that we have been developing at the Ringling. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this off of the page here. The Ringling respectfully acknowledges that we are located on the traditional homelands and the ancestral territories of the Seminole Tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, as well as the ancient tribes of the Calusa, Uzita, and Tocobaga. We also acknowledge the local freedom-seeking community called Angola and the people later known as Black Seminoles. Okay, so I am going to start out with, the Sheridan Tapestries, and I apologize, I know this is a very alliterative title, but Laura signed off on it, so I think I'm safe. So what are the Sheridan Tapestries? The Sheridan Tapestries are a group of 4 tapestries, some of the most magnificent examples of Baroque textiles in the States, and certainly at the Ringling as well. The name Sheridan is appended to them in reference to one of their previous owners, Civil War General Philip H. Sheridan. 3 of these 4 tapestries were purchased by John Ringling at auction in 1924 and have been at the Ringling ever since. You definitely, if you've walked through the museum or Cottazon, over the past years, you've certainly come across them. Right now, these 3 tapestries are off view. They require treatment at the moment, and we don't usually do these sorts of things, projects about objects in storage, but during some routine provenance maintenance over the past year, we came across this sort of incredible story about the life of these tapestries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it was something that I felt like I had to share. It touches on a whole range of issues, from the Civil War to the rise of modern American museums, from tariffs and taxes to the taste of tapestries in America. And as it turns out, these particular tapestries were some of the most prized, talked about, and visible tapestries in America in the last years of the 19th century. Yes, so onwards. There we go. Okay, so the 3 that are at the Ringling are Alexander urging his men to battle, which is this one here. Alexander slaying the lion, which was until recently on view at the Cottazon, on the west wall of the Great Hall of the court. And then the third, I'm having trouble here. Third, Alexander rescued from the Cydnus River. These tapestries were woven in Brussels in the second half of the 17th century by Jan Lenier, and they are based on designs from the first half of the 17th century, most of them by Jacob Jordaens, Flemish painter and designer of tapestries, as his contemporary Rubens was. Designs were generally passed down from weaver to weaver, as was the case with these tapestries. And at sometime after 1650, they end up with Jan Lenier, who weaves at least 3 sets of these. So what is a set of tapestries? A set of tapestries generally sort of encompasses a narrative, in this case, scenes from the life of Alexander the Great, the 4th century BC Greek king, who sort of expanded the Greek Empire from the Mediterranean down to India, and whose career is still sort of the stuff of lore today. Alexander was very in vogue as a subject in this period in the 17th century. So this comes as sort of, it's not an outlier in that regard. So the set to which the Sheridan Tapestries belong, so there are 4 Sheridan Tapestries, they belong to a set of eight tapestries showing scenes from the life of Alexander. A complete set exists, was made for the Cardinal Flavio Chigi, and they are still in the Chigi Palace in Rome, which is the seat of the Italian Prime Minister. So if you're ever if you pull up some Italian news and you see the Italian Prime Minister signing some documents in the background, Alexander slaying the lion, you might think, wait a minute, that looks like the Ringling, but there are others of these floating around. So of the Sheridan Tapestries, we've discussed the three that are at the Ringling today. The fourth is unaccounted for, but here's an image of it. This is Alexander the Great, victorious, presented with arms, and adored as a god by the people. I've not been able to trace this particular tapestry to any collection, private or otherwise, but it comes up at the same sale. John Ringling just does not buy this one. So those are the four Sheridan tapestries, the ones that were owned by Sheridan. The other four from that set of eight, I've only been able to track down one at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This is the family of Darius at the feet of Alexander. So today we're only going to be talking about the four tapestries associated with Sheridan, whose provenance until the late 19th century, we don't know a whole lot about. There's almost this 200-year gap. So what could have happened? What are the possibilities? Well, it's quite possible that they were purchased by an Italian agent, for an Italian family in Brussels, where these were made. There are some sources that suggest how reliable they are, we don't know. Some sources suggest that they perhaps were owned by a cardinal. So much like Cardinal Chigi, these could have been owned by a cardinal. So this is quite possible. But what we do know is that by the our story starts when they show up in Italy in the 1870s and 1880s. So this is sort of the launch into their story as objects, or their history as objects, in this period that runs from the 1870s through to the early 20th century. So in 1876, John Schuler Crosby is appointed American consul in Florence, a post at which he will serve until 1882. Crosby comes from is a descendant of sort of high-standing families in New York. He's sort of used to circulating with people with money. The end goal of saying this is that he has a lot of connections back home in the States. During his time in office in Florence, he is sort of commended for he arrests this band of American art forgers, for which he receives the Order of the Crown of Italy. When he leaves the post, he meets with the king and queen. But for us, the most important act that sort of concerns our story, while he's in office, he replaces his vice consul in 1880 with a man by the name of James Jackson Jarvis. This is James Jackson Jarvis, a portrait of Jarvis in bronze, when made during a time when Jarvis was in Italy. Jarvis is an art critic, dealer, collector, who lived in Florence for more than 30 years, during which time he's friends with the sort of all the main expats and American expats and important Anglo-Americans living in Florence and in Italy. If you've been to the Yale University Art Gallery, a large portion of his collection is kept there. But Florence is an important sort of center for Jarvis as a dealer, as a collector. He writes that Florence is the center of the bric-a-brac trade, he calls it, which is sort of a funny appellation. And in his words, he says, Florence is both the cheapest and dearest emporium of antiquarianism. There are things that are sort of to be bought at bargain prices as well as inflated ones. But all in all, there are a ton of things sort of flowing out of Italy at this time to places like the States. It's a time when the Italian aristocracy is in decline, and the contents of their homes is being sold off. Jarvis writes about walking into old family homes and not quite know with a local guide and not quite knowing what's for sale and what's not. It's sort of a point and, you know, and inquire sort of situation. So at the time, James Jackson Jarvis is acting as sort of an agent as well for wealthy Americans. A few months before he is appointed vice consul, there's the famous Demidov sale in March of 1880, for which Jarvis is apparently buying on behalf of the Boston Museum. Crosby, John Schuler Crosby, then consul, is also there and also acting as an agent for wealthy families. So for wealthy Americans. So he's supposedly buying for James Gordon Bennett, founder of the New York Herald. This sale is is widely covered in the press, in the Anglo-American press, as well as the continental European press. And Crosby's name comes up a number of times, including in an auction catalog. His name is listed next to the famous Demidov vase, which is at the Met, which he purchases supposedly for Rockefeller. So this might sort of strike us as interesting, given that he's officially the consul, but sort of making some deals on the side. Probably not something that would necessarily happen today, but in this period, the consul of Florence was intimately involved with the art trade. Even after Crosby leaves, the subsequent consuls are often called up for exporting art out of Italy into the States. So just this past weekend, I looked through a number of the consular dispatches, the notes sent from Florence to back to DC to report on things, which are usually pretty dry. They're about commerce, agriculture, weather. All of a sudden, once Jarvis comes on the scene, many of them are filled with information about art, from exhibitions to what certain American and Italian artists are doing. There are notices for gifts to museums. The Metropolitan is one of them. And it's sort of interesting reading some of the passages. You get the sense that Jarvis is looking, they're all signed by Crosby, but Jarvis is sort of looking over his shoulder, sort of, potentially dictating some of these things. The language seems much more of art critic than consul. So what does this mean for the tapestries? Again, we don't know a lot, but it appears that Jarvis, at some point at his time in Italy, in Florence, buys these tapestries. Crosby, in a note, in sort of a buried note in a newspaper, says that Jarvis found them in a villa not too far from Bologna, that they were then purchased by Crosby himself, and then purchased by this man, John William Mackay, who was an Irish-American industrialist, made his money in silver mines. He's one of the so-called Bonanza kings. And he's in Europe around this time. He's in Europe in 1879, 1880. And there's sort of an interesting side story involving John William Mackay that we don't totally have time to go into here, but I'll just briefly sketch it out. He gets involved with a venture to link railroads from New York all the way to Mexico City. And this deal is struck with an Italian count who ends up being the husband of John William Mackay's wife's sister. And this is ostensibly part of the reason why Mackay is also in Italy. The wedding is held in Rome in 1879. So for this venture, which ultimately fails, and which Mackay doesn't have an active interest from the start, does not have an active financial interest in, but is sort of a backer giving moral support, I suppose. The Count brings over to Texas, where the line is beginning, over 1,000 Italian laborers. And so the name of the railroad becomes known as the Macaroni Line. Whether this sort of is important for our story is sort of unclear, and we'll touch on this later, but it does put him in sort of Italy. So he very well have come by Florence. So for some reason, and we don't quite know why, Mackay decides this would be a good idea to give 4 tapestries showing scenes from the life of Alexander to Philip H. Sheridan, the Civil War, by then post-war general, but a general who had served in the Civil War, cavalry general. And the motivations, again, are not entirely clear. Certainly the subject matter makes sense. To compare sort of Sheridan to Alexander would, of course, put Sheridan in this sort of favorable light. But why send them at all? Could it have been for his services in the Civil War? Could it have been perhaps the wars fighting Native Americans? Sheridan was actually stationed in Texas after the war to deal with issues at the border between the United States and Mexico. Could this possibly be a link, given the fact that Mackay around this period is involved in this venture, which will sort of take him to Texas? We can't say. There is a much more tangible link, however, in that Sheridan and Crosby did know each other. Crosby had served under Sheridan in the Civil War and in the West after the war. Here they are pictured together. This is from 1883 on an expedition to Yellowstone National Park, which Sheridan was sort of involved in sort of saving from railroad development. He was sort of instrumental in that. So if I don't know if you can see my cursor, I hope you can, but at the far left sitting here, that's Crosby, and sitting next to him is Philip H. Sheridan. There's Sheridan's brother, Michael. Here's the President Chester Arthur. And over here in this fun cap here is Robert Todd Lincoln, President Lincoln's eldest son. So this is sort of a who's who of late 19th century Civil War veterans and political people. So, okay. So on to Sheridan. Here he is sort of later in life after the Civil War. So Sheridan was a Civil War general known to us for his sort of brutal scorched earth campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, also for the brutal wars that he waged against Native Americans in the West. In the 1870s, he sort of came to the aid of Chicago during the fire, during communist riots, sort of keeping up martial law, which I think many at the time found as being sort of a suppression, but the idea being that he would stop looting. Whatever we sort of, and I mentioned that he's involved in sort of saving, in a sense, Yellowstone National Park. However we feel about him now, certainly his legacy is sort of much more complicated, I would say, now, but at the time, he's very much an American icon. He sort of continues to rise through the ranks until late in life, he's appointed what is effectively the highest position, a 4-star general. He's known then as a great military man, not so much, however, as an art collector, which makes this whole thing sort of interesting and also bizarre. So this whole scheme to send the tapestries to Sheridan, we have a little bit back and forth between Crosby and Sheridan that is sort of kept in the Sheridan Papers, which is in the Library of Congress. And Crosby writes in February of 1881, proposing the idea to Sheridan, hey, there are these 4 tapestries. Mackay would like to give them to you. What do you think? And Sheridan writes back, accepting. But then he writes back again and says, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't such a good idea. And he writes to Crosby saying, I spoke with my wife. She helped me realize that the tapestries would be too large for our home. They're living in Chicago at the time, and they would have to be stored. And he feels like these sort of treasures, these artistic treasures would sort of ill fit him as someone who couldn't properly display them. But at the end of the day, he says, I'll leave it up to you, Crosby and Mackay. We don't have further letters between them after this letter in early 1881, but it appears that Crosby and Mackay obviously move forward with the plan. And from sort of piecing together certain sources, it appears that at least by August 1881, they seem to be in the United States. So this takes us to the second part, or the next part of our story, which is what they do when they arrive in the States. So again, Sheridan doesn't quite know what to do with these. He's living in Chicago, where they're just sort of laying dormant. They are kept apparently in the Honor building in Chicago, where Sheridan has an office. So he's not necessarily keeping them at home. And so this is where Charles L. Hutchinson comes onto the scene. He was a founding and longtime president of the Art Institute of Chicago. Today, this is one of the most storied American museums, but at this point in sort of 1882, 1883, it's in its infancy. So in early 1883, Hutchinson is planning this big opening for the museum. And to start it off, he comes up with this lone picture show. At this time, the Art Institute of Chicago does not have a permanent collection. It's sort of one of these, it's looking around for potential donors and this thing. And in this period, he convinces Sheridan to loan the tapestries to the Art Institute. And there's a show, the second ever show effectively at the Art Institute of Chicago. Oh, sorry, here are the letters. Here's one of the letters from Sheridan to Crosby, which I failed to show you there. So here is one of the advertisements for the tapestry show. This says Gobelin Tapestries. If you're wondering what that is, it's a tapestry works in France, from where many tapestries were believed to come from. It's also a byword in this period for just nice tapestries. So the show of the Sheridan Tapestries run from early February to mid-March. Sheridan is interviewed in the press about this, and he sort of says, this is the first time I've ever really properly seen them, because I was never able to hang them in my home or anything. And supposedly his favorite, he says, is the Alexander urging his men to battle, which I think makes sense given that the others available, being adored by a god, being wounded in a river, or slaying a lion, were not sort of events in the life of Sheridan, but he was probably quite familiar with urging his men to battle. So these prove the show at the Art Institute of Chicago proves very popular. They're taken down and then rehung in April because so many people had sort of not had the chance to see them and very much wanted to. So sort of what does this mean for the Art Institute of Chicago, for the tapestries? Well, for the Art Institute of Chicago, it was sort of important at the time. It was drumming up support for an institution that was looking to build its reputation and find sort of potential donors to create a permanent collection. This exhibition is largely forgotten today. It was so early and it was sort of few works. And this whole idea of the Sheridan Tapestries has been sort of lost, that it doesn't get a lot of attention now. But it's sort of important in this early phase of the Art Institute of Chicago. As for the tapestries, they become sort of this item, and they are consistently from here on referred to as the Sheridan Tapestries, which is sort of art historical convention that we see. We see, for instance, the Borghese Gladiator, referring to the family who owned the piece. We see that with the Sheridan Tapestries, and it has to be one of the first instances where an American's name is appended to a group of works of art, probably because of Sheridan's status, and also because the provenance of it was not known at the time where they came from. So there was no other name to sort of slot in there. The other thing that is sort of important is that these become hot items. They're all over the press. They are sort of mentioned. Other institutions become interested. One correspondent suggests, hey, these should go to Detroit for a loan show. Very much in the same vein. And among the people who reach out to Sheridan, are the directors of the Southern Exposition, which is to be held in 1883 in Louisville, Kentucky. So we're in the same year. This is to begin August 1st of 1883. So from the sort of winter, spring months to August. And this is to be an exposition mostly about sort of industrial progress, manufacturing. It has a grand opening at which both President Arthur and as well as Sheridan are present. Sheridan is apparently asked to speak, but demurs and does not speak at this opening ceremony. The big draw of this event was the fact that it was lit by electric light bulbs, some 5,000 of them. Thomas Edison was a one-time Louisville resident, and this is supposed to be sort of this epic sort of unveiling, we could say. So Sheridan agrees to lend them, and by this time you can tell Sheridan's sort of attached to these tapestries, at least in some sense. He's in the correspondence between the directors of the Southern Exposition and Sheridan. He's saying, make sure you take care of them. You know, they need to be hung this way and whatever. So he's sort of forming an attachment to them, even though he's not really able to, you know, they're either in storage. They've been either in storage or on loan for the whole time he's owned them. So as we've said, it's mostly dedicated to this exposition is mostly dedicated to the idea of industrial progress inside this main large building, which you can see here. Are examples of the country's most advanced machines, engines. This is in line with the sort of exhibition mania in the second half of the 19th century, which is kicked off by the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. So there are tons of these exhibitions, especially throughout the States in this second half of the 19th century. The flip side of this sort of showing off of industrial progress is also what to do about sort of culture, art. What's the sort of flip side here? And the art building sort of becomes or sort of an art wing or gallery or hall becomes sort of a fixed, part of the part of these expositions. You can see over here in the bottom right corner of this advertisement the much smaller art gallery, and I think sort of it's interesting to note that the sort of carriages that are being pulled, the streetcars that are being pulled, everything seems to be at a fast pace, as if to say, you know, industry is happening all the time. Technological progress is around us. And sort of the art gallery is much more sort of sedated. It's much more about sort of leisurely walking around the gardens on the way to the art gallery. So at the end of the day, though, the art gallery is always sort of subsidiary, plays a subsidiary role. And to sort of highlight this as well, this is a layout of the grounds of the Southern Exposition. And here's the big building that we saw. And over here on the right is the tiny little art gallery nestled into the lake. And next to some fountains and everything. So it's still sort of playing second fiddle. And it's not the highest priority. And we know that because when the exposition opens on August 1st, the gallery is still not hung. The art gallery is not finished. The tapestries are not even hung until August 6th. The gallery does not open until August 10th. Despite that, the art gallery receives a certain amount of attention in the press, which I think is the case with all things in an exposition. Everything is commented on. That's part of the sort of that sort of comes with the territory. And there seems to be some anxiety about, well, will people be able to appreciate this stuff, this art? And it says something, I think, about America the States in this time, in the 1880s, and in the South in particular, that America is beginning to sort of compete on an international level in terms of industry, in terms of politics. But the question is, what about the trappings of culture? Where are we just, is this sort of like a brute force industrial empire that we're building without the kind of the culture to sort of to back it up? And there just seems to be the sense of what is it all worth if you can't admire a pretty picture? So the Sheridan Tapestries are, probably because of the person they're associated with and their size, are given a place of honor in the galleries. And they are hung in the rotunda, the main hall of the art building. And these are these wonderful stereo cards that were produced showing parts of the exposition. And we can see in the background here, behind this palm tree, which intrudes pretty boldly there, but Alexander urging his men to battle. Sort of placed here are examples of American marble sculpture, including, you can see a bust of George Washington. They are, here's another one, perhaps Alexander rescued from the Cydnus River. It's sort of hard to make out, but back here in the upper register here. So how visible they actually were, I'm not quite sure, if there was a palm tree in the way and they were sort of behind these, sort of cordoned off this way. But they are commented on quite a lot in the press, and a guidebook is produced on the works of art in the art gallery, and they are given a number of pages in this. And it's interesting to note that, sort of in keeping in line with the themes of the exhibition, there's more interest here in the process of their manufacture than perhaps what the scenes show, and telling what the scenes show, or any discussion of their aesthetic qualities. The tapestries are, in this context, I think, considered objects of industrial art. It's sort of, again, fits in with the themes of this exposition, and sort of has to go along with what expositions and these nascent American museums are trying to figure out, especially with tapestries, because with tapestries, you can talk about a workshop of laborers working on a loom to produce these, which sort of fits in with this idea of technological process. You might not even feel the need to comment on how beautiful the seams are, or any sort of art historical considerations. So that's the Southern Exposition. And again, news travels fast about the Sheridan Tapestries, and it reaches the ears of the directors of the National Museum. The National Museum is built in 1879. It opens in 1883. It is now the Arts and Industries building at the Smithsonian, which has been closed for a number of years, but is apparently opening at the end of this year with some new exhibits. It's the second built Smithsonian building after the castle, and is right behind the castle to the southeast, I suppose. And they're sort of a great choice for the tapestries. It's a new large space, and Sheridan has since moved to DC. His friends raised money for him to have a house in DC, and apparently also did not take into account the fact that he owned these tapestries, which were quite large, and still there was no room in his house. So the tapestries are deposited on loan to the National Museum and placed in the North Hall here. So this is the North Hall at the sort of bottom of your screen here. And this is what the mall, so this would have opened up on what is now the mall, if you know your sort of DC geography. And they are placed right at the entrance to the North Hall. And they can be seen here in sort of the center of the picture on the wall over here. So if you ever have sort of a moment, go on the sort of Smithsonian site and sort of start looking at images of the North Hall in this period, and you'll find the Sheridan Tapestries there's some great images, all of which I cannot show because there are sort of dozens of these, but sort of interesting photos to look at. So they are at the National Museum, which itself is sort of a natural history museum. It's committed to displaying specimens of the natural world. There's birds, shells, this sort of thing. There are also ethnological exhibits as well, but it's really about all kinds of knowledge. It's an encyclopedic Museum. From the 1889 guidebook, we read that, quote, "The museum, however, is not merely a place of deposit for scientific material, but by means of a thorough classification and the illustration of the history of human culture, it is destined to become the most comprehensive and instructive educational exhibit in the world." It is supposed to be this museum of record, one committed to education, and in many ways, a patriotic national education. And one way to sort of achieve this goal is through historic relics, showing historical relics associated with the sort of the great men, quote, of American history, is something that has a tradition that stretches back to sort of America's earliest museums, created by Charles Wilson Peale and his sons in Philadelphia and Baltimore. This is the long room from the State Hall in Philadelphia, where busts of naturalists and George Washington sort of preside over exhibits and drawings of birds and specimens of the natural world. So there's this sort of hierarchy built in. It's the idea is to inscribe this sort of collection of natural history and this advancement of knowledge about the natural world within a narrative of nationhood, American sovereignty, and American history. And this is not just sort of, we don't see this in the wake of the Revolution, but up through the 19th century, and then especially again after the Civil War. War relics are placed on display. Personalia, those effects and objects associated with famous Americans, are put on display. Sheridan actually has some of this stuff. He has some Grant memorabilia, memorabilia associated with Ulysses S. Grant. And together with the tapestries, he also loans to the Southern Exposition in Kentucky some Grant memorabilia. Interestingly enough, Sheridan also sort of during the war had sort of allowed a certain amount of looting from his troops, which this becomes sort of a phenomenon in itself. But Sheridan is able to sort of in some way acquire the table on which the terms of the surrender forces at Appomattox. He gets this table and he gives it to Miss Custer, and it's now on view, I think, also with the Smithsonian. So this idea, especially after the Civil War, placing objects on, I think people would have been sort of very familiar with this idea that you place objects relating to the Civil War, memorabilia associated with sort of Americana. This is a way to sort of form a common history and celebrate the victory in the Civil War. Now, we're mostly talking about Northern contexts in this case, but it's a way to sort of place Washington, Jefferson, Franklin in a line that stretches all the way to Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan. And we must remember that this is sort of the idea being that these are a few great men who are being shown at the expense of sort of others, and sort of the patriotic acts they are involved in. So the same goes for, I'm going to go back to our image here of the North Hall. The same goes for the Smithsonian, where most things are sort of designed in this sort of as a taxonomic exhibit with lots of glass cases. And then there's the North Hall, the History Hall, which doesn't quite fit. It becomes sort of this repository of stuff that doesn't fit into other categories. And I think it would be fair to say that a contemporary visitor visiting in the 1880s, 1890s, would be a little flummoxed as to what they were seeing once they sort of saw a lot of mollusks and then saw some tapestries and some effects associated with Ulysses S. Grant. But I think however confused they were, they would have come to expect this kind of thing from a museum. They wouldn't have been necessarily surprised to see it. And in sort of an exhibition context. So now I just want to briefly talk about the National Museum and what is physically placed around the Sheridan Tapestries and how that sort of informs the reading of them in this context. So we can see over here, if you can see my cursor, there's a large painting sort of hanging over and casting a shadow on one of the Sheridan Tapestries. And that is a painting of Ulysses S. Grant and his family by William F. Cogswell. So it's in sort of in keeping in good company. There are sort of, it's also, you can see it in the background here. You can see it in the background in both of these images. On the one on the right, it's placed next to sort of relics associated with General Grant. There are things like swords and medals, but also domestic objects. There's a bit of, on the left here, you can see one of our tapestries next to a piece of oak tree, a bit of oak tree that had been riddled with bullets during the Battle of Spotsylvania in 1864. Here's an image of them next to statues of George Washington, and sort of his effects, but also domestic objects that he owned. So his china, for instance, is placed right here next to the tapestries. So there's also sort of, you can see our tapestry in the back here, and this is Washington's bed. So I think in this context, we can certainly say that the tapestries, their sort of reading of the tapestries in this context has more to do with their owner than with any sort of artistic worth that's been assigned to them. Following the sort of early Smithsonian vision for a good label, they're written with plain language, written with bold text that's very readable. And you can actually, in some of these images, you can zoom in, and the quality of the image is so good that you can read the label. And there's information there about maker and date, but there's also a line that says these were deposited by Sheridan, which I think, a visitor at the time, it would have clicked to them, clicked to say, oh yeah, so okay, that's why these are here. That's why they're in this hall. I think there would have also been sort of an understanding that, okay, well, these were owned by Sheridan, but they also sort of they comment on Sheridan's military victories or the history of Sheridan as a general, and sort of an association with Sheridan and a slippage, we could say, between Sheridan and Alexander would have almost seemed natural. There are some interesting sort of comparisons between them. They're both military commanders, of course, who are associated with horses, and Sheridan's case is a sort of a cavalry commander, and they both have horses that are famously named. Alexander's horse is Bucephalus, and Sheridan's is Rienzi, which he renames Winchester later on. Both were apparently little. We note Sheridan was 5 feet 5 inches. He's called Little Phil. There's a great quote from an 1884 newspaper that says, quote, "There is no waste timber about Sheridan, not much of him physically, but snugly put together." And in the same article, he's in this sense compared to Alexander, among other small military heroes, including, of course, Napoleon, who's the staple as far as small military commanders go. In an address, and sort of one of these other examples of the overlap between Sheridan and Sheridan and Alexander, in an address given at his funeral in 1888, the American Cardinal James Gibbons implicitly compares Sheridan and Alexander when comparing sort of the differences between ancient and modern warfare. There's sort of an interesting story, potentially apocryphal, that comes out and is repeated in the papers, that a janitor of the National Museum at the time that these are on view was asked about this particular tapestry, which was on view of Alexander being saved from the Cydnus River. And the janitor said, "It's just General Sheridan himself. He's been fighting and they're washing him off." So this idea that Sheridan and Alexander have something in common, I think sort of is something that, again, would have seemed sort of natural. So in the early 20th century, so they're on view in the North Hall, and sometime in the early 20th century, or in the first years of the 20th century, they are removed to the lecture hall. And again, they are accompanied here by Cogswell's portrait of the Grant family, as well as this painting by Henry Sandham called The March of Time, showing famous Civil War personalities, including William Tecumseh Sherman, who obviously you can't see, this is quite zoomed out, but Sherman's in the front row. So this is sort of the triumvirate of sort of Civil War generals here. We have perhaps Sheridan in the guise of Alexander, we have Sherman, we have Grant. So again, this is the idea that at this period, the tapestries are not so much valued for being sort of art objects. They fall into the category of personalia, objects owned by Sheridan. So we're going to go into the sort of taste portion of the talk, which is the taste for tapestries and how the Sheridan Tapestries either do play a part in the rising taste for tapestries in late 19th century America, or they do not. What we can say, however, whether the sort of conclusion is that they are important in changing attitudes or not, is that they are probably the most visible tapestries in America for the last sort of 15 years of the 19th century. No other institution, no other cultural institution or museum is hanging a set of tapestries or a part of a set of tapestries for this long of a period of time and giving them and placing them in such a trafficked sort of area of their institution. And as we've said, it's sort of one of the first instances of an American's name being used in the conventional naming of artwork. So we move on to what is, there are tapestries in the United States at this time, but where are they? They are mostly placed in the context of Gilded Age mansions. There are a few collectors like William C. Whitney here who are very passionate about these things, who are hanging them at every possible angle. But mostly they serve in the American context as just sort of a necessary backdrop in a house that's furnished to emulate European taste, culture, and style. And with the exception of a few spaces, of a few of these homes, there are sort of few of these homes are properly suited to the display of tapestries, as you can partially sort of see here. They sort of turn angles, they're hidden by stairwells, they're overlapping each other. This is not a house that was necessarily designed with tapestries in mind. It's not until really the start of the 20th century that starts to change and houses are designed with tapestries in mind. Sometimes the tapestries are purchased already and the house sort of built around them. So how do we shift into a phase where tapestries become sort of leave the Gilded Age mansion and start to make it into a museum context? Well, one of the, or just sort of the interest in tapestries beyond being sort of just a decorative, just a necessary decorative element. And the taste starts to sort of ramp up in the 1880s and 1890s, the same period when the Sheridan Tapestries are on view. And one of these sort of most important moments is in 1889, when retired wool merchant Charles Mather Folk buys over 100 tapestries from the Barberini collection in Rome and brings many of them back to the States. And he starts to create a market for these things. He brings these tapestries in, he organizes exhibitions, he starts to sell them, he creates a market for them in terms of scholarship, in terms of authentication. He writes pieces for the newspaper. He even plans a monumental work about tapestries, which would have included a section of tapestries on view in the States, which we have to imagine would have included the Sheridan Tapestries at this point. It's interesting to note that Folk at the time lives in DC, where he certainly would have known about the Sheridan Tapestries. Now he's on visits to Europe for a large portion of that time, and it would be sort of silly to suggest that the tapestries have a wholesale influence on him, but he certainly knows about them, as we'll discover later on. One of the things he does as well is he adds a section of his house. He just builds another house onto his house, which was completed in 1892 to show these tapestries, and it's sort of built with tapestries in mind. The walls are 16 feet high. So so this is sort of this sort of first step, or an additional step into sort of what becomes sort of a tapestry mania. But what about museums? We've talked about them being sort of not having shown them as much. So this is a period when American museums are just being built, and they're sort of having to ask questions about, well, what should we show, and how should we talk about those things that we do show. And some museums do have tapestries, but they're generally industrial museums, like the Field Museum, which grow in Chicago, which grows out of the Columbian Exposition. And they, for instance, have 2 textile galleries completely dedicated to textiles, but with this sort of theme of technological process and comparative anthropology, where you sort of look at a textile from Europe and compare it to one from South America, with this sort of clear hierarchy built in. And a lot of the museums in this period, including Philadelphia, what becomes the Philadelphia Museum of Art, are showing these things, but they're often infused with these nationalist sentiments about kickstarting sort of a domestic industry. The idea being that if you sort of showed examples of tapestries, local wool merchants might sort of get some ideas. Whether that worked or not, I think is why this is sort of this interesting period when museums are trying to figure out what to do. But within the 1890s especially, we start to see this shift from classifying specifically tapestries as industrial art and redefining them as something that is high art. And that has to go with the sort of what the museums are defining themselves as, whether they're sort of a museum dedicated to showing industrial objects, or a museum that's more interested in the sort of aesthetic qualities of a piece, less on sort of the history of its manufacture. But still in this period, in the 1880s, 1890s, there are no substantial permanent collections in museums of tapestries. There are a number of loan exhibitions, many of them organized again by Charles Mather Fulk, who had purchased all of these. So in 1893, there is an exhibition in MFA Boston, as well as tapestries at the World's Columbian Exhibition, as we've said. In 1896, the Barberini tapestries go on view at the Art Institute of Chicago, at the Penn Museum. In 1897 and 1908, tapestries go on in DC. So a certain amount of sort of interest in tapestries is developing in this period, but still not to the levels that we see later. And sort of the big game changer here is the 1909 Payne Bill, which repeals this hefty tax on artworks over 100 years old that are being imported into the country, coming into the country from abroad. And once this tariff is repealed, the United States is flooded with art, chief among which are tapestries, because they are so large and sort of valued. They are often taxed quite. The taxes on them are exorbitant. So after this 1909 date, again, a lot of tapestries are entering the United States. A number of exhibitions are planned at some of the most important institutions, especially on the East Coast. Museums they're not quite collecting. They don't quite have a sturdy permanent collection quite yet, but they rely on these sort of long-term loans, similar to what happened with the Sheridan Tapestries. So they start to build spaces for these tapestries. So Boston builds a tapestry gallery here, with, you can see, in sort of a space that has enough room to dedicate to large-scale works. Cleveland Museum does the same thing. There are these, again, we've said that there are these long-term tapestry loans. This is what happens at the Met. At least it doesn't quite work out that way, but Pierpont Morgan gives many of his tapestries, loans many of his tapestries to the Met, some of the tapestries make their way into the lobby space. This is an image of around 1907. And this sort of idea of putting them in a lobby becomes a model for other institutions. They're large-scale works. usually of narrative, with narrative showing something sort of heroic and like Alexander, for instance. And again, this is part of this. This contributes to this idea as institutions like the Met begin to shift towards showing art as high art and not as industrial art. The tapestry gets sort of redefined in that way. Another one of the sort of defining factors in this shift from industrial art to high art is the writing about tapestries, which really sort of takes off in the early years of the 20th century. Many things had been written, many things were available, but they were published in French and German or published in the UK. There was really little writing about tapestries in the States. Folk, for instance, had planned this monumental work about tapestries, but it's never realized. And there are two principal writers in the States in this time, George Leland Hunter and Helen Churchill Candie. And Hunter especially sort of is very active in promoting tapestries, not only in his scholarship, but also organizing exhibitions, doing speaking tours. He also works with dealers. So by 1916, he can declare at last, tapestries have triumphed in America. And there's a lot of bombastic speech about this, whether they really triumphed, I don't know. But the idea is that he would sort of make information about tapestries long available in Europe, accessible to an American audience. And that is the case with a lot of these books. They're very accessible. One of them, for instance, is called The Practical Book of Tapestries. And one of the sort of, so this is sort of Hunter's goal, is to sort of promote tapestries, but at the same time, we've said he's going on these speaking tours, he's working with dealers. There's some sort of self-promotion in here as well, some money being made off of this scholarship as well. So he's working with dealers like Duveen Brothers, like French and Company, who are sort of the two of the principal dealers working in America, selling tapestries to Americans. And he's helping create a market for this stuff. So in the books that Hunter publishes, for instance, most of the images for those books come from dealers. They're courtesy of dealers. A lot of dealers are loaning to the shows that he's organizing. At some of these shows, some of the tapestries are even going up for sale. I think there's a note that says, "Inquire at the front desk if you'd like to buy this," which of course wouldn't really go today. But this is the sort of climate. And part of this, so part of the market that's developing is this a preference for certain kind of tapestries, for Gothic tapestries, so earlier tapestries than the 17th century Baroque ones that are in which the Sheridan Tapestries fall into as a category. And while Hunter gives much space in his scholarship to Gothic tapestries and much space in exhibitions to Gothic tapestries, not so much for Baroque tapestries. In 1825, in that Practical Book of Tapestries I mentioned, he writes, "This is a practical book. It sticks to the facts." And then once he sort of gets through the different periods of art, he gets to Baroque, and he says, "Many of the Flemish tapestries woven in the 17th century are unattractive." So there's a sense here that even if the Sheridan Tapestries had sort of continued to be on view in the National Museum, which at this point they are not, and which we will discuss in a minute, they might not have even made it into these early texts. And this is perhaps some of the reason why this story has been sort of largely forgotten. So again, what can we say about them? We can say that they were exceptionally visible, that they were at a museum that was accessible, that would have been accessible to just sort of the layperson coming in. But again, they're sort of classified as either industrial art and heavily associated with Sheridan, to the point where they're considered sort of more personalia than art object. And they are off view in a museum context by the time that the books that already have a bias against the Baroque are being written. So now we come to the sort of next and for the sort of final phases of this talk. I promised you in the title of this to talk about taxes, and I will deliver, because there's nothing more fun than talking about taxes. So Sheridan dies in 1888, and the tapestries legally belong to Irene Rucker Sheridan, his widow, and his brother. And in 1903, those two decide to put to recall the Sheridan the 4 tapestries from the National Museum and place them up for auction. They're valued, we are told, between 35 and 50,000. They're to be sold in DC, and at this auction in May of 1903, all the big tapestry collectors are there. Folk, for instance, the one who in 1889 buys the Barberini collection and is very important for sort of spreading information, knowledge, interest in tapestries, is there, tries to buy them, but the bidding only reaches 15,000, so they're withdrawn. And this is where the taxes come in. The tax authorities sort of get wind of this. They are appraised, and a property tax is issued on them. And it is said that Irene Sheridan must pay $225. She sort of contends, she tries to sort of fight back, but it's sort of decided at this point. In this moment, the Sheridan Tapestries being sort of famous works of art in the States, and Irene Rucker Sheridan being such an important figure, raises this question. So it raises it reignites debates associated with taxes in art that had been sort of long brewing. One of them is, well, why is this property in DC being taxed? A lot of sort of senators and Republicans senators and representatives, had complained about this very thing. Irene Rucker Sheridan, for instance, tries to get them categorized as heirlooms and therefore exempt, but that does not pan out. The other debate that it sort of reignites is the debate on tariffs on art, which we said, the big game-changing moment, the watershed moment for this is 1909, when those hefty tariffs are repealed. But in 1903, those tariffs are still in place. So we get a lot of sort of interest in the press about, well, what's going on here? This should be rethought. This should not be the case. We want the sort of interest in art in the United States to grow, not to be stymied by these taxes, which had been in place since around the Civil War, trying to raise money. So this is sort of a very interesting moment where the tax authorities are sort of having to contend with Irene Rucker Sheridan, who, as you said, is sort of a principal figure in the American sort of landscape. And at this point, she's the last of the Civil War widows after Julia Grant's death, Ulysses S. Grant's widow. And she tenaciously sort of holds on to her status. She famously quips, you may have heard this saying one time, that she would rather be the widow of Phil Sheridan than the wife of any living man. And certainly this sort of, this begins to come to a head, and authorities, not wanting to avoid a scandal, decide, okay, we need to do something about this. So Congress, not wishing either to, have a scandal with sort of a famous American and widow of Civil War hero, but also not wanting to sort of rewrite any tax code, just puts a solve on this and does what Congress does best. It passes a bill. And the bill provides specifically for the Sheridan Tapestries and the Sheridan Tapestries alone. And it reads thus. So this is passed in 1904. Provided that the personal tax for the fiscal year 1903 levied against certain tapestries, which were presented to the late Lieutenant General Philip H. Sheridan for gallant and meritorious services, and which are on exhibition in the National Museum, be canceled, and that no personal taxes be levied against said tapestries so long as they are exhibited in said museum. It appears that after the failed auction, at some point, perhaps wishing to make the tax authorities reconsider, redeposits them at the National Museum. And so this bill is passed, which, if you are ever doing any law research and decide to go into the code of the District of Columbia and type in Sheridan, this will come up. It's still inscribed in the code. So this is 1903, 1904. They're supposedly in the National Museum, and sort of weirdly, this is closer to our date, but we don't know what happens to them between 1904 and 1909. And in 1909, they show up in the collection of George Crocker, railroad magnate, and and are on view at his his home in New Jersey, the Darlington estate in Mahwah, New Jersey. And how exactly they got there, again, we don't quite know. Perhaps they were sold privately. Perhaps Miss Sheridan was approached privately. Perhaps they went through a dealer. That's been something that I have not been able to find thus far. This is the Darlington estate. It's still standing, actually, and it's actually on sale. So if you have, a lot of if you're interested in the Darlington estate, you can inquire with I think it's being sold through Christie's Real Estate. So a piece of history in New Jersey there. So so Crocker puts them on view. They're put on view in the Great Hall. This is the fourth one, Alexander being adored as a god. The one that does not make it into Ringling's hands. And Crocker dies in 1909, shortly after this article is published, and the whole building and its contents are sold to Emerson McMillan, an American banker, and he keeps them on view in the Great Hall. And this is sort of a dodgy picture here, but the same image of Alexander being adored as a god is here, but it looks as if the other tapestries are right there with them. So they're in New Jersey, and Emerson McMillan dies in 1922, and then the contents of the house is sold 2 years later at auction, and Ringling is there at the auction. He, of course, had a house in New Jersey at the time, and purchases them from this 1924 sale, sort of clearly trying to furnish Cottazon, which is being built at the time. And it's this sort of early evidence. 1924 is a pretty early date for John Ringling's collecting. It doesn't really shift into high gear until the later 20s. But it's this early evidence that he's trying to achieve that kind of status that the early Gilded Age collectors had by not only buying the stuff that looks like the stuff that they have, but actually buying the objects that they owned. So he buys these and puts them in Cottazon. Here's Alexander slaying the lion, which, as I've mentioned, have until recently was there, not on continuous view, but it was there recently. And there's another sort of image from a similar time period, we think, showing two of them together, Alexander slaying the lion and Alexander urging his troops into battle. So part of the bequest, enter the museum collections, and they're shown at Cottazon and the Art Museum on and off throughout the years. This is from 1997 when they were placed in Gallery 21. So this concludes the portion of the talk, and I hope it was sort of, we were able to say something about the Sheridan Tapestries as sort of important for sort of very visible objects in the late 19th century, who in the early 20th century, who perhaps did not, perhaps missed out for a period on being as influential as they could be in this sort of tapestry mania, but that nonetheless were sort of commented on and sort of help us also get a sense of the trends of tapestry collecting and what was thought about sort of their status in America. So thank you very much. I don't know if I'm going to stop my share. I'll leave it on just in case we want to, but I'll accept questions.
Stop it, Kyle, so people can see you. And then if we need to reference other images. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have a question from Ingrid in the chat, and then I have a question that builds on her question. So if you'll indulge us. So Ingrid is saying, might the display of the tapestries tied to Sheridan have been a means of elevating Sheridan as more than merely a military man, but also an educated and cultured man? And then my related question is, do you think John Ringling, when he purchased these tapestries, was aware of this association with Sheridan and was sort of trying to place himself in this lineage of great men, or was more interested just in the fact that the Darlington mansion had clout in and of itself? So a lot we just threw at you there, but if you don't mind sorting that through for us.
Well, I'll answer the second question first and say that I think that it more has to do with the latter, that he's sort of mostly interested. I don't know how much, again, we don't, about we don't know a lot about, we don't have a lot of firsthand sort of documentary evidence about Ringling's collecting, and of course nowhere it said that, you know, I want to be like these other people. But I would think that it has more to do with a famous with the New Jersey collection than with association with Sheridan. Although Sheridan in that auction catalog is mentioned as having previously owned them, so you know he would have known about that. I don't know if that would have piqued his. I don't know if Ringling was a Civil War buff, you know, but so in answer to that question, yeah, I think it would be more about emulating earlier sort of Gilded Age collectors. And in the first instance, that's a very good question. I'm not so sure that Sheridan himself would have been sort of interested in being considered, you know, an art collector, nor like I don't know if people would have, if people necessarily would have made the association. Certainly, that's the idea of the gift is intended to sort of remind Sheridan, I suppose, of the status that he had, that his you know, his victories, his military career, and all of that. So that's very flattering in terms of Mackay giving them to Sheridan. But I'm not quite sure about Sheridan as art collector as a I think that that wouldn't have been a category that he would have felt he fell into, nor other people. He owned, you know, these tapestries as sort of this bizarre story, and then he owned Grant relics and Civil War memorabilia. So
thank you. We have some kind of more technical questions about tapestry, and I don't know, Kyle, if you want to take some of these, but we have a question: what is the difference between a woven carpet and a tapestry? And then some questions about how do you restore a tapestry? Can the faded colors be recovered? Thinking about the condition of the tapestries. So two different kind of technical questions there.
Okay, I will answer the second one first, because the first one I don't know if I can properly answer. This was an interesting project for me, mainly because it dealt with a medium that I'm not entirely comfortable with or had interacted before with, which is tapestries. And also I generally tend towards European, Italian history over American history. So I was revisiting things like the Civil War that I hadn't really thought about since I saw Ken Burns', you know, Civil War series. So, but the tapestries can be, the colors can be sort of restituted to these tapestries. That's happened before. They've been restored before, for instance, in the 80s and 90s, these specific tapestries. But this is certainly a question for Barbara. I don't know if Barbara's on this call, but they can be vacuumed, for instance. They can be treated with water. So there's a number of ways to treat tapestries in a sort of sustainable and effective way. But beyond that, I don't know if I can comment. And then in the case of a woven carpet, this did not require me to sort of learn a lot about the technical aspects of tapestry making, which certainly is something that I'm hoping to turn this into perhaps a larger project, perhaps hopefully get it published, because I think it's sort of an interesting story. But I'm afraid I can't answer the first question. So,
Kyle, do you think it would be fair to make the distinction that tapestries are usually some sort of like artistic narrative that's being presented and always meant to be displayed vertically on a wall, whereas carpets are maybe more decorative, and I would assume maybe have less of a sort of narrative presented and more of a decorative scheme? I don't know.
I think that's right. I think especially in the 17th century, in sort of big narrative scenes are the preference, including, you know, this is not the only 17th century Alexander group, for instance. So the idea that they're placed on view in sort of a grand space on the walls, I think you're right. I think you're right. Would distinguish them from something like a woven carpet, which is, you know, on the ground and decorative and does not necessarily include narrative scenes. So.
And I know we've gone over time, but we have one more question from Ingrid. What is next for you? Might we see you as a future employee of Ringling? Fingers crossed. Put in the fingers crossed.
Well, thank you. I don't know yet. I'll be done in a little less than a month, and I don't know. I've got some things to sort out. But whatever happens, whether I remain at the Ringling in some capacity or not, I've enjoyed thoroughly the last 2 years of my job here, and I hope I hope whatever my next steps are include sort of parts of the job where I can share sort of stories like this, because I think it's a lot of fun, and hearing your interest in them as well is really, really makes them come alive. So thank you all for, sort of attending, a lot of familiar faces, and I appreciate that support. And these are always a lot of fun. So.
Well, with that, we will wrap up. Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you for everything you've contributed to the Ringling over the past 2 years. It's been great working with you.
And you as well. Thank you so much.